Okay, so for this class, we're going to go over environmental policy. We're going to try to follow the same approach to policy analysis that I went over last class for healthcare. I'm not going to go through the whole um, Miliband Palancis debate again, but after last class, I think I pretty much established the framework for how this kind of analysis is done. So let's go through it and let's now try to apply it to environmental policy. So, climate change, toxic chemicals, PFAS, forever chemicals, as they're often referred to, and failing water infrastructure threaten public health and ecological stability. The EPA, or according to the mainstream policy approach, the EPA will identify a problem, Congress passes a law, the state enforces it. Of course, we know the reality is much more complicated than that. In our view, again, drawing upon Palancis and Miliband, the state is structurally constrained by capital accumulation. Policy is shaped by class interest, institutional fragmentation, and the need to maintain business confidence. The core question: why does U.S. environmental policy consistently fall short of scientific recommendations? So, once again, how do we go through this? Identify the state form. So, the state form is a neoliberal, financialized capitalism with emerging authoritarian statism features. The crisis and ecological legitimation crisis, extreme weather, rising seas, and public health scandals, for example, the Flint water crisis, threaten the legitimacy of the entire system. Functional requirement: the state must reduce emissions and pollution to maintain order, but it must not disrupt the profitability of fossil fuel, chemical, and agricultural capital, or trigger a capital strike, disinvestment. Businesses pull out their investment out of the economy, which will cause a crisis. Um, the prediction is that policy will be market based. So any environmental law will be mostly made up of subsidies, and tax credits will be incremental, small scale, and non-disruptive. And we'll turn later to the Inflation Reduction Act passed under the Biden administration. Of course, that's pretty much exactly what it is. But you have to do more than just, again, identify the state form. You have to map the command posts as well. Just like the ACA had Baucus, Emanuel, and Lieberman, environmental policy has specific gatekeepers. So again, we're talking about the Biden administration here. You have the EPA administrator, Michael Regan, Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, oversees R&D and the overall energy grid. You have Secretary of the Interior, who controls public lands, and when those lands are leased out to fossil fuel companies. You have so that's in the executive branch. Then you have the bureaucratic gatekeepers, the so-called deep state of the EPA. You have Radhika Fox, who oversees lead pipes and wastewater, Joseph Goffman, air, climate regulations, and Barry Breen, land, who oversees the Superfund regarding toxic waste. Mapping the class fractions. Who is fighting? So you have fossil fuel capital, oil, gas, and coal. Their goal is to keep leasing land from the federal government, weak methane rules, no carbon tax, strategy, lobbying, funding, climate denial, and litigation, lawsuits. Then you have renewable capital, solar, wind, electric vehicles. And again, we should keep this in mind too, right? It's easy for people to demonize the fossil fuel industry, but you have to keep in mind, of course, on the other side of this fight, the renewable energy sector are just as much capitalist as the fossil fuel companies are. So their goal is to get tax credits from the government, grid upgrades overseen by the federal government, and domestic manufacturing mandates, policies that will favor domestic manufacturing here in the United States. Strategy, coalition building with environmental groups. Then you have heavy industry and agribusiness. Again, their goal is to avoid strict chemical bans and expensive retrofitting their operations to be more in line with environmental policy. And then you have finance capital, which is divided, right? On the one hand, they want environmental sustainable goals and climate disclosure, but at the same time, they remain the top financer of global fossil fuel expansion. Then you have the institutional constraints, the rules of the game. So you have the Senate filibuster, which requires 60 votes for major climate legislation. This forces Democrats to use budget reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes, but also limits what can be passed. It basically has to be more or less in line with existing laws. The Supreme Court, citing West Virginia versus EPA in 2022, the ruling limited the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. From a Milibandian approach, this was a contingent judicial decision, a 6-3 conservative majority, not a functional requirement of capitalism, but it did fundamentally change the policymaking process. So, the ruling by the Supreme Court, had it gone another way, would not have significantly disrupted the requirements or the needs, basically, of the capitalist system. But in this case, this is more or less a contingency originating in the very conservative Supreme Court. Then you have federalism as well, this sort of division of power between the federal government and state governments. Red states actively resist and sue to block federal rules, while blue states lead. Now, one of the readings I assigned was this report from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which shows you the reality of implementation, how well the Environmental Protection Agency is actually implementing laws that have been passed regulating the environment. So the GAO is supposed to be a nonpartisan watchdog that tracks whether agencies actually do their jobs. In the 2021 letter to Administrator Regan, it saw that there was a government-wide implementation rate of 77%. The EPA's implementation rate was only 62%, near the bottom. So basically, even when laws have been passed, the EPA is not properly implementing these laws almost 40% of the time, which is a lot. It's not the majority, but it is still a significant amount. There are 101 pending fixes that need to be made. Again, you go more through the details of the letter itself or the report itself. Even when Congress passes laws, the EPA struggles to enforce them due to resource starvation, legal pushback, and political resistance. Going a bit deeper into it, toxic chemicals and water, they identify 7 recommendations to deal with environmental regulations of toxic chemicals. The problem, though, is that over 50 chemicals nominated for review, by the EPA, but the IRIS program is only a resource to work on 15. No strategy to obtain toxicity data, no access to European chemical data, which generally have stricter requirements. So the EPA literally lacks the capacity to tell us which chemicals are poisoning us. So out of 50 chemicals that they want to review, they're basically only working on about 15, only basically about studying the effects of about 15 of these potentially toxic chemicals. So quite a lot are just not analyzed, basically. Area 2, water pollution. GAO told EPA to issue new regulations for total maximum daily loads. EPA's response, refuse, claims it lacks authority. The GAO says you do have authority, you are choosing not to use it. So they're not properly regulating water pollution as well. Climate and cyber risks, managing climate risks, require Superfund sites to assess climate change risks, flooding, and fires. The EPA disagreed with this, stating existing processes are adequate. The GAO's view, they are not adequate. The EPA is ignoring a core existential threat to its own infrastructure. So they are not properly managing climate risks as well, at least according to the GAO. Cybersecurity, particularly over the water systems. Water utilities are vulnerable to hacking. The EPA has no process for organization-wide cybersecurity risk assessment and has not fixed this since 2019. Now, if we turn to the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, this is a signature, law passed under the Biden administration. It is in many ways as significant as the Affordable Care Act passed under the Obama administration. Some people refer to as the ACA of environmental policy. Whether that's a compliment or not, I guess will depend on your perspective. I think that is probably an accurate way to characterize it. However, only if you consider the massive limitations of the IRA, as we've done already with the Affordable Care Act. The biggest climate investment in U.S. history. It's widely touted as $369 billion. What the IRA actually does, tax credits for electric vehicles, solar, wind, and heat pumps, massive subsidies for carbon capture, which is considered to be a lifeline to fossil fuel companies. This idea that you could keep using the existing energy sources, but devise some way to literally, capture the carbon that they are throwing off. Again, generally seen as a benefit for the fossil fuel companies, probably not very effective, very, very costly from what I've read, like in reports on like clean coal and things like that. And also allows for continued fossil fuel leasing on public land. So this is supposed to be a major progressive step forward for environmental policy, yet it has major concessions to the fossil fuel companies. What the IRA does not do, there's no carbon tax, meaning a tax on carbon emitting industries like oil, basically fossil fuel companies. No ban on fracking, and of course, no nationalization of energy, meaning the government taking control over the energy sector, which is still, of course, left in private hands. Explaining the IRA through the framework that we have adopted. So again, the structural approach explains the shape. The IRA is market-based. It is, again, tax credits, no real mandates, no real sort of coerciveness on fossil fuel companies to actually do anything, or really to even empower more renewable sources of energy, other than just giving people tax credits, supposedly to make it economically feasible for people to adopt renewable energy like solar. The state functions to incentivize private capital to go green rather than forcing it. Why? Because forcing it would disrupt capital accumulation. So again, we see the limitations placed on policy here, right? The state can't go beyond a certain point. It can try to work within the confines of a basically profit-driven economic system, but it can't do anything that would actually undermine the accumulation, the growth and expansion of capital, basically. So that's the structure, the interaction of that with agency, people, acting, basically. Why no carbon tax? One specific actor, Joe Manchin, a senator from West Virginia, blocked it to protect coal interest. So again, once again, a Democrat basically sabotaging the bill, just like the Democrats basically sabotaged the Affordable Care Act. And of course, taking into consideration, of course, that you can't even count on a single Republican to vote for these things, even though they're broadly popular. As far as the goals and the problems that they are trying to address, these are things that the broader public wants to see addressed. But you can't even count on a single Republican vote. So all it really takes is a handful of conservative Democrats, basically, to again essentially sabotage any of these laws, which of course is what basically happened. Why continued fossil fuel leasing? Specific deal making to secure Manchin's 50th vote. Why does implementation lag at only 62%? Bureaucratic fragmentation, underfunding, and specific political appointees disagreeing with GAO recommendations. The environmental policy making process summarized. Again, there clearly is a problem identified here. There is a scientific consensus on climate and various toxins harming people. So this creates public pressure. This could be referred to as a legitimation crisis. In other words, if the government does not respond to this, it will lose its credibility or its I always have a hard time saying this word. Its legitimacy in the eyes of people. Agenda setting, the executive branch identifies regulations but is limited by Supreme Court rulings. Policy formulation, Congress drafts bills, but the Senate filibuster forces everything through narrow reconciliation, excluding bold ideas like a carbon tax. The IRA passes, but again, like I said, it is basically just heavy on subsidies, light on um, penalties, so it doesn't really do anything to sort of curb the power of the fossil fuel industry. Implementation, as the GAO points out, the EPA lacks resources and faces political resistance, resulting in a 62% implementation rate and 101 open recommendations that have not been addressed. So key takeaways here: structure sets the fence. In other words, it establishes the boundaries. The state cannot move faster than fossil fuel capital allows without risking economic chaos. Agency builds the gate. Who gets in and out, basically. Who occupies the EPA, the Supreme Court, and the Senate dictates how the transition happens. For example, Manchin shaped the IRA. The Roberts Supreme Court kneecapped the EPA. The real battle is implementation. Passing a law is step one. Step two is actually enforcing it, and the GAO report shows the EPA is failing this miserably. The EPA uses symbolic actions to manage public anger, while substantive enforcement lags. Now, of course, what is the ultimate fate of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act under the Trump administration? It's basically been completely taken apart in three different phases. So phase one, the executive freeze. On his first day in office, President Trump issued executive order unleashing American energy. This order did not merely signal intent. It directed all federal agencies to immediately pause the disbursement of all funds appropriated under the Inflation Reduction Act. This executive action froze approximately $20 billion in IRA funding for climate adaptation and clean energy projects. The freeze was immediately met with legal challenges, with federal courts issuing temporary injunctions against the administration's actions. Despite these rulings, the administration continued to resist disbursement and filed appeals. So the tax credits and the subsidies to allow for the adoption of renewable energy has basically been frozen under the Trump administration. However, this was just the opening act. The administration then used the budget reconciliation process to bypass the Senate filibuster and pass the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law on July 4th of 2025. The legislation effectively repealed or severely weakened the majority of the IRA's climate incentives. Estimates suggest it repeals over $500 billion worth of IRA clean energy tax credits over the next decade. It also rescinded unobligated funds for climate justice block grants. And then finally, phase three, to ensure compliance, President Trump signed a subsequent executive order directing the Treasury Department to strictly enforce the termination of the clean energy production tax credits. This was not a passive repeal, but an active push to shut down the programs as quickly as possible. So these are basically detailing what was terminated or what was left to or let to expire under Trump: residential clean energy credit, energy efficient home improvement credit, new clean vehicle credit, previously owned clean vehicle credit, the clean energy ITC PTC, clean fuel production credit, and the Solar for All program, which, as it says here, is unlawfully terminated by the EPA, leading to a multi-state lawsuit. Now, if we were going to, we use this framework to try to explain the passage of the IRA and its limitations. Now, how do we explain the actions of the Trump administration, which is basically phased out or gutted or undermined the Inflation Reduction Act? Is it more a case of agency? Is it just Trump acting in his own sort of contingent, and his administration acting in its own contingent way? Or is it more an aspect of structure. And of course, the reality is both aspects matter. This seem to be more sort of driven by the agency of the Trump administration. So if we apply Miliband's focus on who occupies the command post and specific institutional maneuvers, the repeal is clearly an agency-driven event. So it was, contingent on the electoral outcome of 2024. The election was a specific historically contingent event. Had Kamala Harris won, or had Democrats held the Senate, the IRA would still be law. The structural logic of capitalism did not change between 2022 and 2025. The personnel in charge of the state did. Specific actors, the repeal required a president willing to use executive power aggressively, which of course is what Trump did. A Democrat would not have issued that executive order, for example, freezing the funds. The legislative tactic using reconciliation, again, the repeal passed via the One Big Beautiful Bill Act using budget reconciliation, procedural rule that allows a 51 vote majority in the Senate. This is a classic Milibandian institutional constraint. It is not a functional requirement of capitalism. It is a specific Senate rule that allows a narrow partisan that a narrow partisan majority exploited to bypass a 60 vote filibuster. The Manchin role reversed, just as Joe Manchin blocked the carbon tax in 2022. Specific Republican senators in 2025 dictated the shape of the repeal. They kept the biofuels mandate and some farm state subsidies while gutting EV credits. These were political horse trades, not structural demands. And I think you can make that argument because, the IRA already in its form was so severely limited, and I think its limitations do mostly depend upon the structural constraints around the policymaking process, that whether or not it was capped or not, didn't really make, I would say, that much of a difference to capital itself. But let's look at it from the other point of view. While agency pulled the trigger, structure loaded the gun and pointed it in a specific direction. The IRA was structurally fragile. The IRA was never a structural transformation. It was a market-based, subsidy-driven policy because it relied on tax credits rather than nationalized industries or physical infrastructure mandates. It was institutionally weak. A future administration could dismantle it with a simple majority vote, which of course is what happened. Polancis would say the state never allowed the IRA to become embedded because doing so would have required disrupting property rights. The energy state form, the neoliberal state form, which is generally against regulations. The repeal aligns perfectly with the neoliberal state's form's functional requirement to remove barriers to capital accumulation. By cutting EV mandates and renewable subsidies, the state is actively removing costs for fossil fuel capital. The state is not acting against capital, it's acting to restore the natural flow of accumulation to the incumbent fossil fuel sector. So if the law was more beneficial to capital accumulation from the get-go, it probably would not have been repealed. The reason why it was repealed is that it was already sort of on thin ice because of the sort of pre-existing bias against any kind of real regulation of capital to begin with. Then you have business confidence, the so-called capital strike, the refusal to invest in the economy. Why did moderate Democrats like Manchin and Sinema oppose a carbon tax in 2022? Because fossil capital threatened a strike. Why did the Big Beautiful Bill Act pass in 2025? Because the donor class signaled loudly that they preferred deregulation over green subsidies. The state, once again, you could say, bowed to the structural power of capital. But like I said, it's really a bit of both. Trump's executive orders froze funds immediately. The IRA was just subsidies, not nationalized infrastructure. Republicans used, again, reconciliation to bypass the filibuster. The neoliberal state favors deregulation over planning. Manchin blocked carbon tax in 2022. GOP blocked EV credits in 2025. Fossil capital has a structural veto over energy policy. So, essentially anything that they don't like, they can basically block. If Harris won in 2024, the IRA would still be law today. But again, even if the law continued to exist, it was not much of a threat to capital accumulation in the first place. Even if Harris won, the IRA would still be fragile and reversible. Now let's look at Parenti's book, chapter 8, because he talks about the environment here. This is more just to provide a lot of context and background information, which you might find interesting. So Parenti argues, of course, that privileged groups consume resources disproportionately while shifting environmental costs onto others. Economic and environmental diseconomies are externalized rather than paid by corporations. Essentially, corporations pollute the environment and then, uh, you know, shift the cost to the government to essentially clean up after them, clean up their mess, basically. Industrial pollution: industry dumps over 100 billion pounds of toxins annually, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, mercury, etc. About 1,000 new chemicals are introduced into the marketplace each year with very limited safety data. Around 10,000 oil spills annually release millions of gallons of oil into coastal waters. Deforestation and land loss: less than 20% of original global forest cover remains. Over 96% of ancient redwood forests in the US have been destroyed. Up to 400,000 acres of wetlands are lost each year in the US due to development and agriculture. Approximately 6 million acres of topsoil are eroded annually. Again, all these things, continue on without any real regulation from the state, and we've discussed the reasons why that is the case. Agricultural and environmental impact: industrial meat production is identified as one of the most environmentally harmful activities. Pesticide use has increased tenfold over roughly the last 35 years, while crop losses to pests have nearly doubled. The food system contributes heavily to runoff, deforestation, and ecosystem damage. Chemical exposure and health risks: each person's body may contain 50 to 80 toxic chemicals on average. Many chemicals are endocrine disruptors affecting hormones and reproduction. Drinking water contamination affects large populations. 1 in 5 Americans has excess lead in drinking water. 45 million Americans consume contaminated water in some form. Of course, these are, I think it kind of goes without saying, these are usually in lower income areas as well. Air pollution causes an estimated 50 to 100,000 deaths per year in the U.S. Disease trends and health statistics: asthma cases have increased by 50% per decade. As of 2007, 6.7 million children, 16.2 million adults suffered from asthma. Cancer risks: a child faces about a 1 in 600 chance of developing cancer by age 10. Breast cancer rates among women have tripled since 1940. Pesticides, water, and food contamination: widespread pesticide and herbicide use contaminates food and water supplies. Chemical runoff contributes to soil degradation, biodiversity loss, and health risks. Pesticide exposure linked to birth defects, organ damage, neurological disorders, and cancer. Climate change and global warming: greenhouse gas emissions have reached record highs, nearly double historical averages. Global warming is linked to more frequent hurricanes, droughts, floods, and storms. Many people would argue that the COVID pandemic also, by the way, is a consequence of global warming as well, especially if you accept the sort of natural or zoonotic origin of the disease and not the so-called lab leak theory, which isn't really based on any real evidence. Rising temperatures reducing soil moisture and rainfall. So this is also a consequence of global warming as well. Melting ice caps contribute to rising sea levels and ecosystem disruption. Water scarcity: aquifers supplying about 60% of U.S. fresh water are being depleted. Reservoirs, rivers, and lakes are shrinking in many regions. Industrial and population growth intensify water shortages as well. Biodiversity loss: species extinction rate estimated at around 17,500 species per year are going extinct. Overfishing and industrial activity are collapsing marine ecosystems as well. Ocean pollution: coastal wetlands are disappearing at large scales, tens of thousands of acres annually. Nutrient runoff causes algae blooms and dead zones in oceans. Shipping and industrial dumping continue to introduce toxic waste into marine environments. Ozone depletion, depleting chemicals damage atmospheric protection. Recovery is slow due to long atmospheric lifetimes. Increased UV radiation harms DNA, crops, coral reefs, and marine ecosystems. Economic costs of pollution. Industrial environmental damage costs are often shifted to the public. Cleanup and health related costs are borne by taxpayers rather than corporations. Government spending and policy figures. The U.S. government has provided billions of dollars in subsidies, tax credits, and loan guarantees to polluting industries. Over 25 billion spent on dams and levees with ecological consequences. Around 1 billion paid to defense contractors for pollution cleanup. Nuclear power plants estimated cost 18 billion per plant, excluding overruns. Cost overruns historically range from 400% to 1,000%. Energy alternatives. Renewable energy currently accounts for about 7.5% of U.S. energy production. Wind energy potential in the Great Plains exceeds current total U.S. electricity demand. So he's saying that there's great potential here to utilize renewable sources of energy, but it's just not done. Of course, one of the main reasons, besides all the resistance in the government, is that it's hard to make these things economically profitable as well. Alternative energy sources, solar, wind, and tidal, are presented as scalable, but underfunded compared to fossil fuels. Systemic and economic observations. Industrial systems operate on a model where profits are privatized, environmental and social costs are socialized. Industry continues expanding despite finite planetary resources, water, air, soil, and capacity to absorb waste. Parenti argues this creates a structural conflict between capitalism and ecological sustainability. And again, in spite of that, nothing really gets done about it. Now let's turn to Foster, the other reading I assigned. This is John Bellamy Foster, who's a leading figure and was sometimes referred to as eco-socialism or Marxist ecology. And he basically makes the case here for economic planning. So this would be a much more radical solution, and one which you would see significant resistance due to the structural constraints of the American government and of policymaking to actually implement here. But he argues that some form of democratic economic planning is really the only way you can deal with the ecological crisis. So he rejects unlimited growth as human progress. There is a planetary emergency, a need for radical socioeconomic transformation. What is degrowth? It is a family of approaches rejecting exponential economic growth. So most economists and most governments, cite economic growth as a positive factor. They talk about the GDP, the gross domestic product, and they like to brag about how much the GDP grows every quarter or every year, even if the growth isn't even all that great. They try to spin it into being something better than it actually is. And what Foster's basically arguing here is that this emphasis on economic growth is foolish for a variety of reasons. First of all, GDP doesn't really tell you anything about sort of social welfare or economic welfare of people, but that's another topic. But basically, he's just saying to just prioritize economic growth doesn't, and the way these growth figures are, of course, calculated, doesn't consider at all, the environmental impacts of this economic growth. So he argues for wealthy societies, zero net capital formation, qualitative improvements, reduced working hours, not austerity, what he calls a prosperous way down from extractivist, wasteful development. Targets opulent sectors to improve life for the vast majority. Selective growth and reduction, cut fossil fuels, armaments, meaning weapons, basically, military spending, private jets, SUVs, second homes, and advertising. Grow regenerative agriculture, clean energy, public transit, universal health care, and housing. Requires global redistribution of surplus and waste reduction. Why GDP is a flawed measure. It counts war, toxic products, luxury, consumption, marketing, the financial sector, and criminal justice, all basically get counted as GDP. So do healthcare costs, right? We talked about last class the extremely high healthcare costs in this country. Medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States, but all those costs get counted as economic growth. But would you say that's a good thing if medical costs are continuing to rise? Is that necessarily a good thing? Again, that's another topic, but one which could be applied here as well. GDP also ignores domestic labor, mostly unpaid labor, mostly performed by women, subsistence production, conservation, and reduced toxicity. Capital's value added does not equal social or ecological well-being. Capital accumulation is basically causing what he refers to as an earth crisis. It is the main driver of climate change, species extinction, disrupted nutrient cycles, and freshwater depletion. It creates a habitability crisis for humanity this century. Crossing planetary boundaries, ocean acidification, meaning it's not confined to any one country or any one region of the world. The oceans are becoming acidified. Ozone loss, novel entities, synthetic chemicals, new chemicals being introduced into the environment, into our bodies that we don't really know what these things are going to do. The 1.5 degree Celsius target is already outdated. This is what leading environmental groups say. We have to limit rising temperatures to this level to stave off the worst effects of climate change. According to the IPCC, net zero CO2 by 2050 for 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. So you basically have to cut carbon emissions to zero for even a 50% chance of staying below that temperature threshold. According to Kevin Anderson, now need zero by 2040. Developed countries have to reach this by 2030 and 2035, reach zero carbon emissions in just a few years. According to the WMO, May 2023, 66% chance of exceeding 1.5 degree temporarily by 2027. So it doesn't look good. Why IPCC scenarios are too conservative. They assume continued growth in wealthy countries plus price-induced tech shifts, rely on negative emissions that don't exist at scale and are ecologically hazardous. Scientists' original conclusions, low energy, popular mobilization were censored by governments as well. Technology alone won't save us. 3 decades of complacency means technology on its own cannot cut emissions fast enough. You need low energy solutions plus changes in production and consumption relations. Reallocate from private luxury for the few to public prosperity for the many. So he's identifying the problems, but how do you actually implement these things is kind of the complicated thing here. Planning is necessary and already exists. Degrowth requires social and economic planning to regulate humanity, nature, metabolism, basically our relationship to the natural world and how we consume the natural world for our own survival. Basically, giant corporations and wartime economies already use planning. Plan and planning are back in fashion due to capitalism's contradictions. Well, okay, are they? Marx and Engels on planning, not a command economy. In other words, not the Soviet system of economic policy making. Insisted on cooperative labor according to a common plan, a plan that would be adopted using democratic means. They want to abolish the town and country divide, cities and rural parts of the country, distribute industry evenly, and poisoning of air, water, and land. Of course, anyone that lives in a city knows how overpopulated cities are. People think that this means that the planet itself is overpopulated. Well, that's not really true. There are certain areas of the world, which we call cities, that are severely overpopulated, but there are vast swaths of land in this country that are virtually uninhabited. I read an article once, several years ago, that argued that you could fit the entire world's population into the state of of Texas and give everybody, I forget the exact amount, 500 acres of land, 1,000 acres of land, or so, something like that, more than enough that most people would need. So it's not that the world is over populated in general. It's just that the populations tend to be, concentrated and over concentrated in certain areas. And this, they argue, is basically, a contradiction created by capitalism as well. Why? Because people, go to where the jobs are, and the profit motive, or what Marx calls the law of value, dictates where these economic, operations are going to take place. It would be costly, of course, to spread things out more, but they basically argue that this is something that needs to be done. Freedom consists of associated producers governing metabolism with nature rationally, not a top-down command economy, Foster emphasizes, but democratic, self-governing communities, and what he refers to as associated conductors. I'm assuming people with some level of expertise to sort of guide the process along. Then it gets into a little bit the actual historical track record of the Soviet Union, which he argues is much more of a kind of mixed record than most people would have you believe. Right? Most people just think of the Soviet Union as just one miserable failure after another, and that is kind of an oversimplified view. Right? It did actually have some pretty significant successes as well. So he breaks down the different periods of time. You have what he calls war communism. This is after the Bolshevik Revolution, which then kicked off a civil war against the former regime led by the Tsar and his supporters. Were also supported by basically by the other imperialist countries as well. He refers, this is a very sort of chaotic period of time in the history of the Soviet Union. He refers to this as a desperate nationalization, not true planning. This was a policy that was basically, undergone during a period of emergency, basically. Didn't have really time to plan things out. Then you have what is known as the new economic policy introduced by Lenin in 1921 to 1928. So it outlived Lenin, by the way. State capitalism, which is what Lenin referred to it as. Lenin was explicit that the early Soviet state had only achieved what he called state capitalism with Gosplan control figures. This was like the overarching economic planning council. Under Stalin, who initiated the first 5-year plan in 1929, this initiated a brutal command economy and forced collectivization, breaking up, independent, farmers basically, and forcing them to live on these large communes, basically. It did have some success, though. 16.5% annual industrial growth between 1930 and 1940. This later allowed them to defeat not Nazi Germany during World War II, which, of course, the heaviest fighting was between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Not the role the United States played in defeating the Nazis in World War II is very much a secondary role, though you would never know that to be the case, thanks to all these movies like Saving Private Ryan and things like that. There was, of course, failures as well. There is a bureaucratic nomenclatura, the bureaucratic officials basically sort of ruling without any real sort of accountability to the people as general. The Russians had to deal with obsolete equipment. Of course, they were not allowed to get more state-of-the-art technology due to the economic sanctions placed upon them, stagnation, and eventual collapse due to corruption and lack of democracy. This is a very simplified historical view. That is basically Foster's take on it. And now he turns to communist China. It's mixed economy, what he calls a mixed economy, combining what he considers to be socialist and capitalist features. The command economy period from 1953 to 1978, rapid industrial growth, literacy, and life expectancy. Post 1978, state capitalism again, with 150,000 state-owned enterprises making about 30% of GDP. So 150,000 companies, basically more or less, directly administered by the government. 5-year plans plus state regulation of the so-called heartless and brainless market. Contradictions near U.S. level of inequality, economic inequality, exploitation of migrant labor. So he's, I would say providing a mostly fair and balanced approach of these things. You could get into the whole theoretical debate to what extent could these states be considered socialist and stuff, but that's not really our concern here. Myth versus reality. The Soviet record is not worse than the West. Lower per capita emissions. That's the emissions basically divided by the population. Actually had the largest conservation organization with over 37 million members. Soviet scientists were actually the first ones to raise the alarm on global warming. The ecological civilization concept was first introduced in the Soviet Union, then adopted by China. Foster claims that Cuba is the most ecological nation, high human development with low carbon footprint. And this is, of course, despite a U.S. blockade. What must be done in rich countries? Plan degrowth and deaccumulation. Better, smaller, but better, he says. Shift from exchange value to use value. Shift from exchanging commodities in order to make a profit to producing things that are useful and beneficial to people without considerations of profit, basically. It's a very radical idea, of course. Zero carbon plus equal global per capita shares. Repurpose military budgets. The U.S. spends trillions of dollars to revamp its energy infrastructure. According to a RAND study, 47 trillion expropriated from the bottom 90% from 1980 to 2018, more than the total U.S. housing stock. Critique of mainstream degrowth. Most degrowth proposals avoid planning, nationalization, mandatory cuts, which won't work. He's saying that you can't just leave this up to tax credits and profit incentives and things like this. You need real radical transformative action, basically, in the form of democratic economic planning. He's against the idea of guaranteed basic income under capitalism, which he argues is not a real solution to the problem. Under eco-socialism, caring professions, childcare and elderly care and things like that, arts, education become central. Basically, the final choice is socialism or exterminism, or socialism or barbarism, according to the Marxist theorist Rosa Luxemburg. She seems to be invoking here. And that's it. Now, again, as far as identifying problems go, Parenti and Foster, I think, do a very good job of it. But how do you actually implement these things, especially given the structural constraints of the American state, the structural constraints that capitalism imposes upon that state, the fact that most of the people in power are people who are hopelessly subservient to the capitalist class. It's really hard to see a way forward, at least in the United States. Other countries, you could argue, you could actually probably argue that China is probably better poised to achieve something like this, quite frankly, than the United States is. But if something like this were to happen in the United States, it's unimaginable that it could come to pass without massive, popular protest on the part of people. There's simply no other way. So again, that pretty much wraps things up here. Okay, so take care.